Why, hi, happy 4th of July and another reading from the Mrs Piggle Wiggle Treasury. I'm Miss Barbara from the Huntington Beach Library. Today is 4th of July and we have another Mrs Piggle Wiggle story to read. Now I hope all of you are in our summer reading program. Just go to hbpl.beanstack.com and register. It goes on until August 1st. There are weekly raffles, grand prize raffles, we have mystery raffles, and everyone who finishes the program will receive a goodie bag. So just go to our website and make sure to sign up. So Mrs Piggle Wiggle, for those of you who may not be familiar with Mrs Piggle Wiggle, the series is by Betty McDonald. She's a cross between Nanny McPhee and Mary Poppins, and she's beloved by all the children in the neighborhood as well as their mothers because she can think of wonderful type of cures for common childhood ailments. So we're going to read about one of them today. This is the bad table-mannered cure. So what do you do with someone who doesn't have good table manners? We're going to find out what Mrs Piggle Wiggle suggests from the Treasury of Mrs Piggle, the Mrs Piggle Wiggle Treasury by Betty McDonald. You can also check out other books from our library by Betty McDonald in the Mrs Piggle Wiggle series, and we have some books that can be downloaded from our cloud library with Mrs Piggle Wiggle. This is the Bad Table Manners Cure. Slurp, slop, gulp, bang! Christopher Brown was through with his milk. His mother was in the pantry polishing the silver, but she didn't have to go into the kitchen to see that Christopher was through eating. She could tell because all the loud noises had stopped. Mrs. Brown was terribly ashamed of Christopher's table manners, and she talked and talked and talked and talked and talked to him about it, but nothing ever seemed to change. Christopher was 10 years old and a very nice little boy in other ways. He had red hair. He was a fine baseball player. He was a good sport. He got excellent grades in school, and he kept his room reasonably neat. But he had horrible, terrible, disgusting table manners. No, that's not even right. In reality, he had no manners at all. He ate like an animal, a starving, wild animal. Mr. and Mrs. Brown had gradually become used to Christopher's terrible table manners. Of course, they made him eat in the kitchen, but what worried Mrs. Brown so terribly was that one day, one of Christopher's friends would invite him over for dinner. Not just a children's birthday party. Christopher had been to a lot of those, and he was so much fun and so good at the games that the children didn't care if he ate like a starving animal. No. Mrs. Brown was afraid he'd be asked to stay all night or visit someone in another town or go to the country with some of his friends' families. Oh, how dreadful it would be if the other people could see just how terrible it was when he ate. Oh, and when he began to chew, it was so disgusting. Christopher chewed with his mouth open so you could see all the chewed up food inside, and he smacked his lips. When he was eating, it was so loud it sounded like someone slapping their hands on the water. And he gulped when he swallowed. He washed his food down with milk. He made enormous piles of meat, potatoes, peas, carrots, and gravies with his fork, and then thrust his fork so far down into his throat you could barely see the handle. He used his fingers and his thumb to try to get his food on the fork. He propped his knife and fork handles on the table. He chopped and smashed and mixed all his food until his dinner looked like dog food. And he would pick up his soup bowl, hold it up to his lips, and gulp it down. And he talked when he was chewing. He gestured with food on his fork so that food would fly everywhere. I could go on and on and on about Christopher's terrible table manners, but I think I've told you enough to show you that eating with Christopher was like eating with a wild, starving wolf. Watching him eat was certainly not a sight to whet the appetite. Mrs. Brown rubbed polish on the silver and thought about Christopher's terrible table manners and was sad. "Oh, there should be a school for table manners," she said to herself, "and attendance should be compulsory. They should have to go." Then the phone rang. It was Mrs. Thompson, Dick's mother. She said, "I'm having a few of Dick's friends over for dinner next week on Saturday. My brother Charles, the famous big game hunter, is going to be visiting us for a few days, and I thought it would be so nice if some of Dick's friends could meet Charles and see his movies of hunting lions and tigers in Africa. I was just going to ask Christopher, Hubbard Prentice, and Larry Gray because there'll be 12 grown-ups there as well." Mrs. Brown thanked Mrs. Thompson and said that she knew Christopher would be delighted, and then she went out and made herself a great big giant pot of coffee. Her hand shook as she poured the first cup. Mrs. Brown couldn't even bear to think about it. "What will I do? Whatever will I do?" she said. "She would give Christopher a good talking to, and he'd be very nice and pleasant and agree to everything," she said. "And he would try to have better manners for a meal or two, and then she knew it would happen. He'd go back to eating with his mouth full and slurping and drooling and making messes and just be a disgusting eater." She called her friend Mrs. Perel. She said, "Mrs. Perel, I'm not going to be around the bush. My son Christopher has the worst table manners in the entire world, and I don't know how to cure him. Do Percy, Pamela, and Percy, Pamela, and Potter have terrible table manners, or do they have nice table manners?" Mrs. Perel said, "Why, I'd never noticed, Mrs. Brown. You see, Percy, Pamela, and Potter have always been allowed to make their own decisions about everything. As soon as they were born, we gave them free rein, and actually I haven't seen them eat for several years, so I don't know." "Oh, what do they live on?" asked Mrs. Brown. "Oh, they eat," said Mrs. Perel, "but only the food that when it occurs to them. Now, Potter eats nothing but peanut butter and poppy seeds, and he always eats at night. He says that eating during the day is too common a practice and should be stopped. Now, Pamela eats nothing but hot dogs and bananas. She does her own shopping and peels the bananas herself, which I think is very progressive for a child of 7. Oh my goodness, can you imagine eating a diet of hot dogs and bananas only? That can't be healthy." "Well, I don't," said Mrs. Brown crossly. "I think it's dreadful to let a child live on hot dogs and bananas. What does Percy eat?" "Well, Percy, let's see," said Mrs. Perel. "Oh, yes, Percy. Why, Percy eats everything. He's the most cooperative. Just give him cookies, candies, marshmallows, cakes, ice cream, root beer. You don't have to worry about Percy. He's a fine boy." Mrs. Brown said, "Well, Mrs. Perel, I guess everyone has their problems. You've cheered me up a lot, and I do hope you know a good doctor. You're going to need one. You can imagine if you let your children just eat candy or just peanut butter or just hot dogs. That can't be good for them." And Mrs. Perel said, "Oh, I think not. Both Mr. Perel and I were brought up the same way, and we're both terribly happy. Mr. Perel never eats anything but kippered salmon and grapefruit, and I never eat—" And Mrs. Brown hung up the phone. Kippered salmon and grapefruit? Oh. So then she called, and guess who she called? And it wasn't Ghostbusters. Who was it? She called Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. She told Mrs. Piggle Wiggle the whole problem. She didn't leave anything out when she described the way Christopher ate. And when she told Mrs. Piggle Wiggle about the dinner party he'd been invited to and how ashamed she was that he'd be going, she got tears in her eyes. And Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said, "Now, Mrs. Brown, don't worry so. Christopher is such a darling boy, and I know how to cure him. It's going to take cooperation on your part, and it may be a little inconvenient, but I have a cure. I'm going to lend it to you later, and I'm going to lend you Lester." "Lester?" said Mrs. Brown. "Who's he?" said Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. "Lester is a pig." "Oh, no," said Mrs. Brown. "Not a pig? I have no place to keep a pig, and this is a restricted neighborhood." "Now, just a minute,"
said Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. "Lester is absolutely no trouble. He has beautiful manners, is very quiet, and sleeps in the basement, so nobody in the neighborhood need to know anything about him."
"Well, where should I put his trough?" said Mrs. Brown.
"Oh, dear," said Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. "Lester doesn't use a trough," said Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. "That's the whole point. Lester has the most beautiful table manners you have ever seen, and I want him to eat in the kitchen table with Christopher. You'll be very surprised. Lester will teach Christopher how to eat."
"Well, that sounds fantastic," said Mrs. Brown.
"I know," said Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. "Every mother I've lent Lester to has the same feeling. But let me tell you that once you've had Lester in your home, you won't want to let him come home to me. I've always had that trouble. Everybody adores Lester and they want to keep him. Oh, by the way, he likes to sleep on a clean blanket in the basement floor. And he also likes to have the basement door left open so he can go out for his exercise after dark and when the neighbors are asleep. Have Christopher stop by after school, and I'll have him take Lester over to your house. Mrs. Martin just returned him this morning."
But what does Lester eat?" asked Mrs. Brown.
"Oh, exactly what Christopher does, except much larger portions. He takes cream and sugar, and he often drinks as many as 5 cups at a meal. Now don't worry, Mrs. Brown. Fix Lester a nice clean bed with a blanket by the furnace, and I'm sure he'll solve all your problems. Goodbye."
"So what do you think? Would you like to have a pig come live with you?" Well, let's see how Lester works out." Mrs. Brown went up and got a clean blue blanket out of the guest room closet, with many misgivings, unfolding it and put it on the floor beside the furnace in the basement. She looked at the clock. She had 10 minutes before she could expect Christopher. She made some cocoa with whipped cream, fixed 2 plates of ginger cookies, and one much larger than the other, and polished 2 red apples. She got out spoons and napkins and remembered what Mrs. Piggle Wiggle had said about Lester's manners, and she took 2 of her good linen doilies and put them on the kitchen table, something she could never do when Christopher was eating. Exactly at 3:30, there was a knock on the back door, and there stood Christopher, who usually never knocked, and a large white pig. Christopher said, "Hey, Mom, this is Lester, and we've got to keep him. Oh, he's fun. He's so smart. He knows everything, don't you, boy?" Mrs. Brown said, "Come in, Christopher and Lester. I have some cocoa for you." And Christopher said, "Oh, boy!" And he dashed over to the table and began to gulp his cocoa. Lester walked daintily into the kitchen, closed the door carefully behind him, climbed up, and sat down across the table from Christopher. Christopher was jamming his mouth full of cookie and washing it down with cocoa. Lester looked at him, took 1 cookie carefully between the split of his front hoof, and ate it very slowly and in tiny bites. That's right, because pigs have hooves. So in between the hoof is where he put the cookie. He's a smart pig, isn't he? He picked up his cocoa cup with his other hoof and took 1 small sip and then put it down while he gently patted his snout with his napkin. Christopher stopped eating, or at least stopped chewing to watch Lester eat. Christopher's mouth was open and full, and he had whipped cream on his upper lip and crumbs on his chin. Lester reached across the table and gently closed Christopher's mouth. Then he wiped the whipped cream from his upper lip and the crumbs off his chin. Christopher was delighted. He said with his mouth full, "Gosh, Lester, you're smart." Lester put his hoof across his lips and pointed to Christopher's full cheeks to indicate, "No talking with your mouth full." Christopher looked at his mother. "Isn't he smart, Mom? Isn't he wonderful?" Lester looked over at Mrs. Brown, and she was sure he winked at her. It usually took Christopher about 3¼ minutes to gag down his cookies and cocoa. This day, either because of the excitement of having Lester with him, Or perhaps because of the good example set by Lester, Christopher was still eating by 4 o'clock. Now I have to show you. Here's a picture. These are illustrated by Hilary Knight. And there is Lester the pig, showing Christopher some good table manners. Mrs. Brown came downstairs to clean up the cocoa things and was almost surprised to find Christopher had only finished and Lester was halfway through. Mrs. Brown asked Lester if he cared for some more cocoa, and he nodded his head and handed her his cocoa cup. Christopher said he didn't care for any more and began eating his apple. Gulp! Lester reached across the table, took the apple away from him, got off of his chair and went to a drawer in the kitchen, took out a knife and cut Christopher's apple into small sections, cornered each and put them on an empty cookie plate and handed the plate to Christopher. Wow, is Lester a smart pig. Lester shook his head and took one of the sections and took a small bite. So now he's showing Christopher how to eat an apple when you cut it up into little pieces, into little apple slices. Christopher gulped down the first section and took another, but this time, instead of stuffing the entire slice into his mouth, this time he took a tiny bite. Just like Lester. Lester nodded approvingly at him. At 4:30, both Lester and Christopher had finished their cocoa and apples, and Christopher took Lester down to the basement to show him his bed. Lester looked carefully around the furnace, straightened out several wrinkles in the blue guest room blanket, and nodded at Christopher to show him that the bed was all right. They went into the game room. There was a red tennis ball on the floor. Lester picked it up and threw it at Chris. Christopher caught it and threw it back. Lester caught it neatly in his mouth and took it out with his hooves and threw it at Chris. They played ball until it was time for the mystery cowboy radio programs that Christopher listened to every evening. No, this is like an older story, so back then, way back when, probably when your grandparents were little but children, they'd listen to the radio. I know that my parents would listen to the radio way back when. They'd have stories on the radios. He said to Lester, "Gee, Lester, I hope you don't mind, but I always listen to a bunch of keen radio programs at 5 o'clock. Of course, if you'd rather play ball, I don't have to." Lester shook his head and went and pointed to the fireplace, where a nice little fire was laid. Christopher said, "Do you want me to light the fire, Lester, for you?" Lester nodded, and Christopher struck a match and lit the paper. Lester stretched across the hearthrug and closed his eyes. Christopher crouched by the radio and listened to his favorite programs. It was very peaceful. When Mr. Brown came home from work, Mrs. Brown told him of the invitation to dinner to meet Mrs. Thompson's famous brother, Charles, about Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, and about Lester the pig. Mr. Brown was mostly skeptical about Lester, about being able to teach Christopher table manners. "Talk about the blind leading the blind. Ha! A pig teaching my son how to eat," he said. And Mrs. Brown said, "Shh! Hush, Philip. Lester's right down in the basement, and really he does have the most wonderful manners that I've ever seen." Mr. Brown said, "Guess I'll have to go take a look for myself." He went down to the basement, whistling, "Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf?" Because you know what the big bad wolf did with the 3 little pigs. Mrs. Brown groaned. Mr. Brown looked first in the washroom. No Lester. Then he looked in the furnace room. He saw a guest blanket laying on the floor, and he picked it up, shook it, took it to the laundry room, and stuffed it in the laundry chute. He went around the laundry, looking under the washing machine, the ironing board, saying, "Oink, oink, oink." He got no response. He noticed that the basement door was open a little, so he closed it, locked it, muttering about burglars and carelessness. Then, hearing the radio from the game room, he decided to go in and ask Christopher whether he kept the pig. He was certainly surprised when he opened up the game room, and guess who was there? Lester, the pig. And he said, "Oh, so this is Lester. Oink, oink, oink." Lester opened his eyes and gave him a cold look. And then, seeing it was Mr. Brown, he jumped to his feet and held out his hoof. No, he's being polite, unlike Mr. Brown. "Well, I'll be darned," said Mr. Brown, shaking and beaming. And Christopher said,
"Boy, isn't he smart, Daddy? Isn't he?"
And Mr. Brown said, "I've always said you can teach a pig anything. Pigs are the smartest animals there are." Lester still looked at him coldly, because Lester probably heard all those things he was saying. He hadn't forgiven him for the oink 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 business. Mr. Brown bent over and began scratching Lester behind the ears. Lester gently but firmly pushed his hand away, went over and lay down by the fire. Mr. Brown, slightly red in the face, said, "Well, I guess I better go see how dinner's coming along."
And Christopher said, "Hey, just a minute, Daddy. I want to show you how keen Lester plays ball. Come on, Lester, old boy, let's play a game."
And he picked up the red tennis ball, and Lester rather unwillingly got to his feet. Christopher threw him the ball, and he caught it in his mouth and threw it back. Christopher threw it again, and Lester caught it, but this time Lester threw it to Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown was so surprised he almost missed, but you could tell he was pleased because he kept looking at Lester and smiling. They played three-corner catch until Mrs. Brown called to say dinner was ready, and tell Christopher to wash his hands. There was a small lavatory, that's a bathroom, off the game room, and Christopher rushed in his usual way, wet his hands, splashed a little water in his face, and was going to wipe the dirt off on the towel, when Lester, who had followed him in, took the towel away from him, put it back on the towel rack, put a stopper in the basin, filled it to the brim with hot water, and began washing his own face and hooves thoroughly with lots of soap. When he had finished, he let the water out of the basin, filled it up again with hot water for Christopher. When Lester dried his nice clean face and hooves, Christopher washed thoroughly with lots of soap, and while he dried his face and hands, Lester took the hairbrush, dampened it, and smoothed the bristles on his neck and around his ears. Christopher watched him and then dampened and brushed his hair too, and then they went to dinner. Unfortunately, Mrs. Brown, forgetting about Lester, had spare ribs for dinner. Uh-oh. They were crisp and brown, and Mr. Brown gave Lester an extra helping. Lester sat down and smiled because everything looked and smelled so delicious, unfolded his napkin, and took a sip of milk, and then cut off a small piece of spare rib. He put it in his mouth, began to chew, then turned terribly pale, and pushed his plate away. Christopher watched him and said, "Gosh, Lester, what's the matter? Don't you like spare ribs?" Lester took his spare ribs and put them on Christopher's plate. And Christopher said, "Lester, I'll go tell Mom that you don't like spare ribs. She'll fry you some eggs or something. That's what she does for Daddy when he doesn't like something." He started to get down from his chair. Lester reached over, took a hold of his shoulder. He shook his head sternly, pointed to Christopher's dinner, and by chewing motions indicated that Christopher was to continue with his dinner. Lester had 2 helpings of dressing, sweet potatoes, and string beans. He also ate a salad, 2 dishes of peaches, 2 pieces of applesauce cake, and drank 4 cups of coffee. Wow, the pig likes coffee. Christopher ate all his dinner, and with much less noise than usual. He even asked Lester if it was all right to pick up his spare rib bones with his fingers. After dinner, he and Christopher and Mr. Brown played ball for a while. Then it was time for Chris to go to bed. He and Mr. Brown said goodnight to Lester and went upstairs. Lester went into his bed, but, remember, Mr. Brown stuck it in the laundry chute? The bed wasn't there. He looked all over the basement, thinking perhaps Mrs. Brown had moved it. He couldn't find it any place. Then he checked to see if the back door had been left open and found it shut and locked. He looked again to see if he could find the blanket. It just wasn't anywhere, so he decided to go upstairs and ask Mrs. Brown where it was. Remember, he can't talk, so he's going to have to probably indicate the question to her. He went up to the basement stairs, had quite a time with the basement door, which stuck, trotted through the kitchen, in the dining room, and then stood politely by the living room door. Mr. and Mrs. Brown were playing cribbage and arguing, so they didn't see Lester for quite a few minutes. When Mrs. Brown happened to look up, she said, "Why, Lester, have you come up to visit us?" And Lester shook his head. Then, deciding it'd be a very good way to get them downstairs, he nodded his head vigorously several times. And Mr. Brown said, "Okay, old boy, come on down, Alice, and watch." Mrs. Brown said she'd like to, so they went downstairs. But Lester, in spite of his flawless manners, went first instead of going into the game room, stood by the furnace door. Mrs. Brown looked in the furnace room and said, "But where's your blanket?" she said. Lester shook his head because he doesn't know where it is. "Why, I put it there on the floor this afternoon. I wonder what could have happened to it." And Mr. Brown looked very embarrassed. He went out and got it out of the laundry chute. He said, "Oh, I didn't know it was Lester's bed. I thought it had fallen on the floor." Mrs. Brown spread it out on the floor, and Lester carefully smoothed out the wrinkles and turned one corner over like a pillow. Mr. and Mrs. Brown watched him in amazement. "Why, I've never seen such a smart animal," said Mr. Brown. "He seems almost human." Lester looked up at him quizzically. "Well, now we're all ready to go to bed. I guess we can go back upstairs," said Mrs. Brown. Mr. and Mrs. Brown started up the stairways, but Lester shook his hooves and gently pushed him towards the basement door. "Oh, what's the matter now, old boy?" said Mr. Brown. "The basement door's locked, and there's not a thing to worry about." And Mrs. Brown said, "Well, of course, that's the trouble. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle told me to make sure to leave the basement door open a crack so Lester can go out at night and get his exercise." She unlatched the door and opened it 1 inch. Lester nodded approvingly, went through the doorway. Lester nodded approvingly, waited politely while they preceded him through the doorway and started up the stairs. Then he went in, lay down by the blue blanket, and went to sleep. The next morning, when Christopher came downstairs and found his mother frying bacon, he was shocked. He said, "My gosh, Mother, don't you have any heart at all? Last night you had spare ribs for dinner, and Lester almost got sick, and now you're cooking bacon." And Mrs. Brown said, "Why, Christopher, I thought I had a delicious dinner last night. Spare ribs have always been one of your favorite foods." "But, Mom," said Christopher, "spare ribs are pork, and they come from pigs." Mrs. Brown clapped her hand over her mouth. "Oh, no," she said. "Oh, Christopher, I didn't think about that. I'm terribly sorry. Do you think Lester noticed?" "Yes, Mom, I'm sure he noticed. He took one bite, turned pale, and pushed his plate away. I was going to tell you, but he wouldn't let me." And Mrs. Brown said, "Oh, come on, before he gets up. Take the bacon to your father. I'll give you and Lester cereal, scrambled eggs, and toast for breakfast. Hurry now, take the bacon to Daddy, and I'll air out the kitchen." She opened up the back door, shooed the bacon smoke out with her apron so that Lester came upstairs a few minutes later. The bacon smelled only of oatmeal and buttered toast. As your usual thing at breakfast, Christopher dumped a gallon of cream on his mush, poured 4 heapings of sugar on it, and then stirred and stirred and stirred as though he was mixing cement. When the mush was exactly the right consistency and the correct degree of coolness, he would lift the bowl up to his chin and shovel it in like it was a race. This morning, forgetting all about Lester, he began his usual gluttonous proceedings, dumped the entire pitcher of cream on his mush, and was reaching for the sugar when he looked up and saw Lester looking sadly at the empty cream pitcher. "Aw, gee, Lester, did I take all the cream without sharing? Sorry about that. I didn't mean to be such a pig. I mean a glutton," he said. Lester just looked at him. "Oh, I'll go get some more cream. Wait a minute." Lester shook his head. He reached over and picked up Chris's bowl of oatmeal, and then carefully poured half the cream into his own cereal. Christopher said, "That's right. We'll each have half. Would you like some sugar?" Lester nodded and helped himself carefully to 2 level spoons of sugar. Christopher, who was watching him, did the same. When Christopher started his cement mixer stirring, Lester reached over and took his spoon away and showed Christopher how cereal should be eaten. A spoonful at a time. Lift it slowly and daintily from the bowl so that each spoonful contained hot cereal, cold cream, and sweet sugar. Christopher tried it. He said, "Say, Lester, this tastes much better the old way. I should always eat my oatmeal like this." And Lester nodded approvingly. When Christopher finished eating his scrambled eggs, Lester reached over and closed his mouth 3 times. Because remember, Lester likes to chew with his mouth open. So Lester closes it so he remembers to eat with his mouth closed. No one wants to see the inside of your mouth while you're eating. Not even I do. I don't want to see that. All right, so he only had to do it 3 times. And he showed him that he must break his toast into small pieces. Then he must not hold the toast in the palm of his hand when buttering on jams. You should do it on the plate, not on your hand. He made him put down his milk glass and wiped the milk mustache from his upper lip in between sips. Chris obviously didn't mind these criticisms because he hugged Lester goodbye as he left for school and promised to run all the way home for lunch. It was a beautiful morning, and Mrs. Brown did a large washing. When she went to hang up the line, Lester helped her carry out the clothes bucket of wet clothes from the basement, handed the clothespin to her, must be with his mouth and his hooves, when she needed them, and when the washing was all done, he lay down on the grass in the sun, well hidden from the neighbors by 2 sheets and a tablecloth. Mrs. Brown knelt down and timidly stroked his back. She said, "Thank you so much for helping with the clothes, Lester, and thank you so much for helping me with Chris's manners. I can see a great improvement already." Lester grunted a little. By the night of Dick Thompson's dinner party, Chris's table manners were absolutely perfect, and the Brown family all loved Lester so much they couldn't even think about him ever leaving. Lester came upstairs with Chris while he bathed and got dressed. He washed Christopher's back and made him wash behind his ears twice. He made him polish his shoes, and he sent him back to his room for a clean handkerchief. After Chris had gone, Lester went to the kitchen to wait for dinner. Noticed immediately that there was no place set for him at the kitchen table, and feeling lonely for Chris and quite sad, he started down to the basement to lie in his blanket. Mrs. Brown called to him. "Lester, I thought as long as Chris wasn't here, you wouldn't have to eat. I thought while Chris wasn't here tonight, perhaps you'd like to eat in the dining room with us." And he did. He followed her into the dining room and was able to eat off her good china and use her good silverware. They had roasted lamb for dinner, and though Lester had 3 large helpings, his table manners were so beautiful that Mr. and Mrs. Brown just stared at him in admiration. After dinner, Mr. Brown and Lester played catch while Mrs. Brown washed the dishes, and then they all sat in the living room and listened to the radio and waited for Christopher. He came home at 10 o'clock. Bustling with excitement and filled with tales of Africa and lions. Everyone listened to his stories, heard what the Thompsons had to eat and what Uncle Charles looked like, and then they went to bed. The next morning, Mrs. Brown had 2 telephone calls. The first one made her very proud. It was from Mrs. Thompson, and she said she just had to call Mrs. Brown and tell her that she had never seen such a well-behaved, beautifully mannered boy as her son Christopher. "Oh, his table manners are absolutely perfect," she said, and Mrs. Brown smiled and smiled. The second phone call was from Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, and it made Mrs. Brown very sad, because we know what's going to happen. It's time for Lester to go back home to Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle asked Mrs. Brown how she liked Lester, and Mrs. Brown said, "Oh, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, he has such perfectly beautiful manners. He's such a wonderful teacher, and he's so charming. I just feel like crying when I think of all the time I said people are pigs, or ate like pigs, or selfish like pigs." And Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said,
"Well, of course, all pigs aren't like Lester, but he's certainly a dear, and I hate to have to take him away from you so soon, but I had an emergency phone call from Mrs. Burbank. Tell Christopher to bring Lester over on his way home from school this afternoon."
And when Mrs. Brown said goodbye to Lester, she had tears in her eyes, and she thought even he seemed a little sad to be leaving. But he certainly taught Christopher some good table manners, didn't he? And that is from Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's Treasury. Join me next Saturday at 3, and we'll be reading another cure from Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. Until then, this is Miss Barbara signing off. Stay happy, stay healthy, stay safe.